Hi everyone, and good afternoon. Welcome to my Parsha share this week for Parshat Vayeitzei. Today's Parsha share is sponsored by the Hurt and the Suissa families in memory of their mother, Lois Hurt, Aliza Bas Gershon, Aleha Sholom. Her first yahrzeit was on the 2nd of Kislev, and as any of you who watch my videos on YouTube will know, all of our videos are in her schus, because she had a bunch of friends, Lois had a bunch of friends and very close family members who chose to pay for the equipment that we use every single week in order to record the shiurim and to put them on YouTube. So it's really in her schus that you are able to learn. So Lois, who was a wonderful woman, let me just tell you something about Lois before I begin the shir. Lois came to shul every single Shabbos. She was already an almana for several years, I think even before I came to Beverly Hills. She was an absolutely special woman, very well read, very cultured, very interested in the shul and in the community. But she was also interested in having a relationship with the rabbi, to know me better and to speak to me on a regular basis. And she wanted to choose one special thing which would make her stand out from everyone else in the community. I'll tell you what she did. Every week she read the newspapers. I don't know which newspapers she read, but she would cut out any cartoon that was in the newspaper that had some relevance to something to do with Judaism or to do with the Bible, with the Torah, and she would bring me an envelope, a little envelope, of those cuttings, of those cartoons, to amuse me. I didn't read them in shul, but I would take them home with me, and I'd look through them, and they were always very amusing and very entertaining. And she would give that to me every single time she came to shul. The last few months of her life, unfortunately, she couldn't join us. But long after she had passed away, over the past year, I take out an old jacket of a suit, and inside there's an envelope, and it's those cartoons that she gave me that I must have stuck in my jacket, had a look through and then stuck them back in my jacket. And now I can still be amused and entertained even though she is no longer with us. But it's in her zchus that we study Torah together, that my audience from across the globe, I was just in the United Kingdom, I was in London, and I met so many people who watch the videos that we put out on YouTube, and I know that it's in her zchus and how much pleasure she is having in Shamayim, in heaven, knowing that we are learning in her memory, and her neshama should have an aliyah. We should be zeicha to see tchias hamesim. Parshat Vayeitzei is really, in a sense, the beginning of the story of Yaakov Avinu. And I know that we had him in last week's Parsha, and we already were introduced to him and to his brother Esav in Parshas Toldos. But somehow the story was happening to him at that stage. It wasn't a story that he was engaged in or where we engaged with him. It was still a story about Rivka and Yitzchak. And it happened to be that Yaakov and Esav were supporting actors. Even though they were crucial to those stories, they were supporting actors in the story. Here we begin in Parshas Vayeitzei, the story of Yaakov Avinu. Now, what happened in between the end of Parshas Toldos and the beginning of Parshas Vayeitzei, that space of time, that period of time is figured out for us by Chazal. He apparently spent 14 years engaged in the study of, and it's referred to by Chazal as Torah. Obviously, it's not the Torah that we're studying, but some form of Torah. It's a discussion for another time. I think I've spoken about it in previous shiurim. He was in the yeshiva. It's known as Yeshiva Shem Va'ever. I don't think Shem was involved anymore. I think it's mainly Aver. And what that exactly meant, it sounds to me, and particularly from the piece of Nesivos Sholom that we're going to be learning today, it sounds to me like it was an ancient form of monastery. And this was something which was very common in ancient pagan religions. Obviously, the yeshiva of Shem and Aver was not a pagan monastery. It was a monastery of those who believed in Hashem, of monotheists, of people who absolutely believed that Hashem had created the world, and they were studying whatever form of Torah that one could study at that time. They were communing with God through some kind of medium that is referred to by Chazal as Torah, and they were doing so in complete isolation from the rest of the world. Shem and Aver had created this space which was separated from the rest of the world, which the influences of the world were extremely negative. There was not one person in the world really, besides for those who studied in the yeshiva of Shem and Aver, and the Ovos and their families that believed in Hashem, and they were these bastions, these lighthouses of monotheism in the world, but not very successful in terms of kiruv. I don't think they were that interested in kiruv. We know that Avraham Avinu was interested in kiruv, Yitzchak was not. Yaakov began a process of creating the chosen nation. He is known to us via Chazal as the Bechir HaAvos, the chosen one among the patriarchs, among the forefathers. And why would that be? Why is he referred to in this way? Well, we know that his image was engraved into the Kisei HaKavod, that Hashem has a special affinity for Yaakov Avinu. We also know that whereas Avraham had a Yishmael and Bnei Keturah, and we know that Yitzchak had an Esav, Yaakov Avinu had children, all of whom stayed, as it were, from our perspective, within the fold, and it's all of their children that became the beginning of the Jewish nation, ultimately leaving Mitzrayim and receiving the Torah at Har Sinai. So Yaakov Avinu had no one who left the fold, unlike his father and his grandfather, some of whose children were not part of the narrative of the followers of Hashem that would become the Am HaNivchar, the chosen people who would inherit the land of Israel, the promised land. So Yaakov Avinu is unique, but he's unique for another reason. Avraham Avinu, we see the stories about Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu was somebody, even though he was involved with the world, and we see his interactions with the world, ultimately he is separate from the world. He is somebody who has forged his own path, and he comes to Eretz Canaan at the request of Hashem, or the command of God, and he sets himself up there. He did leave briefly because he went to Egypt, but he came back, and that's really where he stayed, where he remained. And he may have been friendly with a few people. He may have, for example, we know that that he lived in Kiryat Arba, and he was friendly with some of the local landlords. But in essence, he was separated from them. His interactions with them were for practical purposes. Yitzchak was totally separated from everyone around him. We know the story between him and Avimelech, but ultimately his path in life was one in which he lived on his own. Yaakov Avinu is very different. Yaakov Avinu, and this is what's so strange, begins life as somebody who is very isolated from the world. He's Yoshev Oholim, he's separated, he sits in his four amos, his particular location, and he studies, or the way we refer to it is he studies Torah. We're going to see the Nesivos Sholom identifies Yaakov Avinu as Torah, but at the same time, once that's over, once he's been through the experience of Shem and Aver, the yeshiva of Shem and Aver, he goes out into the world. This week's parsha begins, Vayetze Yaakov mi Be'er Shava. All the Mefarshim deal with this, and Rashi deals with this. I gave a share about this earlier on this week in London. I think I've spoken about it before, previously, in Shurim that I've given on Parshat Vayeitzei, how Vayetze Yaakov is a very powerful statement. It means he left where he came from. He went into a new place, but he had to leave that place and go to the new place. He abandoned almost. Vayetze Yaakov mi Be'er Shava. He was no longer part of that milieu. He'd become a new person, and Vayelech Chorona. He really embraced his new life. I've mentioned this before in other contexts. One of the greatest rabbis of the 19th century was a man called Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. And he is renowned because he created the Musar movement. He believed that it was extremely important to align Torah study and mitzvah observance with Jewish ethics. And he single-handedly created this concept of Musar, and many yeshivas adopted it. There were some that didn't. Adopted a seder, a part of each day's schedule. It was part of the curriculum of these yeshivas to study Jewish ethics, whatever Jewish ethic svarim, books they looked at and texts. But the idea was that you cannot be a great Jew simply by being a great scholar. You have to be somebody who matches that scholarship with ethical and moral behavior. Let me tell you about Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter didn't stay in Vilna, even though there's no question about it. He was the senior rabbi in Vilna for many, many years. He left Vilna, and first he went to Paris, and he ended up in a place called Königsberg. And the reason I'm familiar with this is because my father was born in Königsberg in East Prussia. No longer exists as a city under that name. It's now called Kaliningrad, and it's still part of the Russian Federation, even though it's in the area of the Baltic states. It's surrounded by the Baltic states. But Kaliningrad was Königsberg. It was a college town, a university town, very famous because the great German philosopher Kant wrote all his major works in Königsberg. That's where he lived. And Rabbi Yisrael Salanter moved to Königsberg, and apparently, according to the evidence, he abandoned his rabbinic garb and adopted the garb of Orthodox Jews who lived in Germany at the time, which was a short jacket and either a Homburg hat or a bent-down hat. I'm not quite sure exactly how he looked. We don't have any pictures of him. And that's where he's buried. And many years after the Second World War, some point in the 1990s, my father visited Königsberg, and he relocated the position within the old Jewish cemetery, which had been built over, etc., of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter's kever, and they've built something on top of it, and you can visit it there today. If you ever are in Kaliningrad, I don't expect it's a place you frequent too often, but if you are ever there, you'll be able to go and visit the kever of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. The reason I'm mentioning Rabbi Yisrael Salanter and his move to Königsberg, what's so interesting is that the reason, the cause for him leaving Vilna and going to Paris and going to Königsberg was that he felt that to be a great rabbi and a great Jewish moralist and ethicist in Vilna, that didn't require very much. You're surrounded wherever you are in Vilna by people who admire you if you're a great rabbi and who respect you. And of course there are those who don't, but essentially the community is behind you. Go to a place like Paris or go to a place like Königsberg, and to still remain the great Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who pushes the messages of Jewish behavior and of Torah and of mitzvahs, that requires real greatness and real strength of character. And he wasn't somebody who just preached Mussar, he lived Mussar. He wanted to make sure that the message of Mussar and the message of Jewish behavior wasn't something that was limited to Vilna, which at that time was known as the Yerushalayim of Lithuania, perhaps the Yerushalayim of the Jewish world, because Yerushalayim at that stage was very limited in its Jewish community and its infrastructure, and it certainly had no major yeshivas. But Vilna was a place where very great rabbis and Jewish scholars and Jewish institutions existed, and he felt that there, of course, he's the great Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. Let's see if I can achieve something if I go to Paris. Let's see if I can achieve something if I go to Königsberg. Vayetze Yaakov mi Be'ersheva, vayelech Charan. You're going to see that's really, if I wanted to summarize what the shir today is about, it's about this point, that Yaakov Avinu represents something much more than a great person. To be great within the goldfish bowl of a Jewish neighborhood, let's call it. Let's say you live in one of the great from Jewish neighborhoods of the world, whether it's in Yerushalayim or it's in Bnei Brak, or I've just come from London, it's in Golders Green or in Stamford Hill. If you're in New York, it's Williamsburg, it's Borough Park, of course, Lakewood, a town of Torah, a town which has grown specifically because at its center is this fantastic yeshiva, or in the many other, I haven't mentioned, of course, all the many neighborhoods where there are wonderful Frum Jewish communities. To be a Frum Jew in those neighborhoods, of course, it requires effort, but your effort is far less. How about being a Jew without borders? How about being a Jew wherever you are? How about being like the Twersky family, which moved in the early part of the 20th century to Milwaukee and remained so true to the derech of their ancestors, to the Hasidic way of the Chernobyl dynasty And of course, the father was the Horny Stipler Rebbe of Milwaukee and had all these children who went to university, to college, studied for degrees, and yet they emerged with the same enthusiasm and passion for their Jewish identity, hadn't dropped, hadn't diluted, hadn't become something different as a result of their exposure. How do you become a Jew without borders? How do you become like Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik, Rabbi J.B. Soloveitchik, who came from this incredible dynasty, the Soloveitchik family, the Brisk family, and he came to Boston, and he shone, and he remained true to his ideals and to the study of Torah and to everything that his family represented. And of course, later on became the Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshiva University, and the Yeshiva Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, as it's known, RIETS in New York. And he became this beacon, this lighthouse. Vayetze Yaakov mi Beersheva. He left the confines of Brisk. He left the neighborhood of his grandfather and great-grandfather. He was named after his great-grandfather, Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik. And of course, he knew his grandfather, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, and his father, Reb Moshe Soloveitchik, who came to America before him. And he maintained his standard and his derech halimud and his passion for Torah and for Torah study and for his teaching of Torah. How is that possible? How can you be Vayetze Yaakov mi Beersheva Vayelech Harana and still remain Yaakov Avinu? That's going to summarize the whole shir. Don't turn off, because I want to read for you the Nesivos Sholom. I want to go through it with you. You'll see how beautiful it is and how many different nekudos, points, he raises and brings out of this idea of Yaakov Avinu. And he uses as his foundation, your descendants, your seed will be like the dust of the earth, ufaratzta yoma vakedma tzafona vanegba, and you will spread out across the world, whether it's east, west, south, or north. Everywhere you go, there's going to be descendants of Yaakov Avinu, ka'afar ha'aretz. Matzinu b'chazal, we find in Chazal, says the Nesivos Sholom, b'inyan havtocha zu shenemar liYaakov, shehi nachala b'loi metzarim. This is referred to, this promise by Hashem to Yaakov Avinu, this unbelievable revelation at the beginning of Vayeitzei, where Yaakov is told by Hashem that ufaratzta, that your children will be spread out, Yom Avaked Matzafona Vanegba, that is referred to as a legacy without borders. The Gemara in Shabbos adds another angle to this and says, At the moment I'm going to translate this in the way that we would all translate this. Although you're going to see the Nesivos Sholom says the translation isn't quite correct. Anyone who delights, regales in the Shabbos, he will receive this legacy without borders. Shenema. And he quotes a pasuk. The pasuk says, Im toshiv mishavos raglecha, mishabos raglecha, oz tis'aneg al Hashem v'irkavticha b'masei oretz v'achalticha nachlas Yaakov avicha. So there is this idea that Shabbos, like this idea that we see at the beginning of Vayeitzei, we see that Yaakov is referred to as someone who is going to have a nachla without borders, a legacy without borders, and Shabbos is some type of representation of this ideal, of this aspiration of nachla b'li mitzarim. So the Nesivos Sholom goes on to say, like Avram v'Yitzchak, not like Avraham and like Yitzchak. It was restricted, it was limited, it had borders. So Hashem says to Avram Avinu, come, let me show you the land. I'm going to show you its length, its breadth. I'm going to show you the country. Well, obviously a country has borders. A country is not without borders. So that's as far as Avram Avinu is concerned. The like Yitzchak. And Yaakov is not like Yitzchak. Yitzchak also has limitations, has restrictions. Shekosav boy, what does it say about Yitzchak? To you and to your children I will give all the lands of God. What does that mean? Well, we're talking about Eretz Yisrael. We're not talking about the whole world. Unbelievable. Yaakov Avinu has the whole world at his fingertips. Yaakov Avinu has a legacy that isn't limited to the confines of Eretz Yisrael. The Bnei Yisrael, the Bnei Yaakov, can be Bnei Yaakov and Bnei Yisrael wherever they go. They're not limited to one particular location on the globe. Shezuhi nachla b'li mitzorim. What is this? This idea is a legacy without borders, sans frontières, as we call it in French. V'tzorich bia. And says the Nesivos Sholom, we need to understand this. Madua zocher rak Yaakov lenachla b'li mitzorim v'lo Avram v'Yitzchak. Why is it that only Yaakov Avinu has this designation as someone who will receive a legacy without borders, and that doesn't apply to Avram, and it doesn't apply to Yitzchak? V'chein yesh lebar, and we also need to explain, we need to understand this reference point that we have of Shabbos, that why somebody who delights and regales in the Shabbos will receive nachla b'li mitzorim. We don't see that this designation is awarded, is given to anybody else for having kept some other mitzvah in the Torah. There's many mitzvahs in the Torah. How about keeping one of the other mitzvahs, making sure that you always eat kosher, or making sure that you observe Yom Tov, by the way? What about somebody who keeps Pesach? Why can't he experience nachla b'li mitzorim? What about all the mitzvahs that are associated with Bein Adam L'Chaveirei? There's many mitzvahs of Bein Adam L'Chaveirei. Why do they not have this designation of nachla b'li mitzorim? And it's just referenced to Shabbos. So that's what the focus will be of this particular piece, this beautiful piece of Nesivos Sholom. V'yesh lefarish ha'inyan al pi ma shebi'arnu she'yesod midosei shel Yaakov hi kiddush kol ha'inyanim ha'gashmiyim ad liyoisam chelek ha'torah. Says the Nesivos Sholom in explaining what we're talking about. Let's really understand the theme, the central identification of Yaakov Avinu. Who is he? What does he truly represent? So Yaakov Avinu is, for all intents and purposes, of all the Avos, the one that is most, as we might put it in English, a man of the world. A man of the world around him. A man who understands, he does business, he engages with people, he understands the functions of leadership, he understands what it means to live in a world of people that doesn't function like he does, doesn't think like he does, and he brings up his children. In the end, he ends up in Mitzrayim, and he speaks to Parai. But even long before that, before he's established a family, he goes to Choram, where he spends 20 years with an uncle who, to put it mildly, is not a good person. And we know that Yaakov Avinu remained Yaakov Avinu. What does that mean? What is his central theme? What is the characteristic that we can identify with him most of all? I'll tell you what it is. He is somebody who takes the world and he lifts it up to the highest possible level. It's all very well to live in a monastery, in a yeshiva Shem Va'ever, and to be a holy monk. But that's not the way to build up a nation that we can call the chosen nation, that we can give the Torah to, Hashem can give the Torah to. A nation that stands out has to be a nation that's really within the world, and at the same time is holy, and at the same time is sanctified, and at the same time represents the will of Hashem and the message of Hashem. That's what's so important. In fact, it's the most important thing. Who truly represents this ideal? The one of all the Avos, of the three Avos, who truly represents this ideal is Yaakov. We have Avram, a great man. We have Yitzchak, a great man. In fact, these are foundational figures for other reasons. But the one who represents this idea, as it's put here, that Yaakov, it's the Kiddush Kol HaInyanim, to sanctify all matters, Hagashmiyim, that are related to the material, Ad Li Yosem Chelek HaTorah, until such time as they themselves, the most material aspects of human existence, of physical existence, that they are elevated to the level that they are part of the Torah. That is Yaakov Avinu. He quotes one of the ancestors of the Slonimer Chasidus, who says as follows: Shemi Parshat Vayeitzei, Parshosei Shel Yaakov, from Parshat Vayeitzei, which begins the personal narrative of Yaakov Avinu. Onu l'modim eich sheYaakov Avinu herim es kol inyonov v'asokov hagashmiyim. We see how he elevates all the matters that are in his life and all the businesses that he is engaged in, the material aspects of his life, to a level that is at the highest possible point, kol kach ad shemehakol niyah Torah, until every aspect of it becomes Torah. There's another long piece in the Nesivos Sholom that talks about the different spotting and patching of the sheep, of the flocks, and how Yaakov Avinu managed to, by using certain aspects of, I don't know exactly how they do it, but the breeding methods, which meant that the sheep would see the way that the sticks looked, and then would have lambs that would resemble, in their patterning, would resemble those sticks. All of that seems very mundane. Who's particularly interested in the breeding methods of people living in ancient Mesopotamia? But that's something which is central. That's what the Nesivos Sholom says there. Perhaps another year I will go into it in greater detail. What the Nesivos Sholom is telling us is that even the most mundane aspects of Yaakov's existence, even the way he conducted himself in his breeding methods of the flocks of sheep that he was looking after for Lavan, even in that, he elevated it to the level of Torah. How do we know that? Because it's included in the Torah. The fact that it's included in the Torah means, and the Nesivos Sholom actually goes much further than this, means that it is Torah. Inherently, it's Torah. The Nesivos Sholom says that some of the highest and most elevated secrets of Kabbalah are contained in the stories of Yaakov Avinu, which seem the most mundane and uninteresting in terms of what they seem to be teaching us or seem to be saying, at least in their literal translation. And he goes on here to say, we have this dream that Yaakov Avinu had when he was lying there on Mount Moriah, and he's sleeping, and in his dream he sees a ladder, and the way the ladder is described is mutzav arza. It's firmly established on the ground. But the head of the ladder, the top of the ladder, reaches all the way into the heavens. Obviously, we're not talking about the sky. We're talking here about the elevated heavens, not the physical sky. And it's definitely meant to convey a message, says in the Nesivos Sholom. What are we drawing out of this imagery? We're drawing out that all of those matters, the material matters of life, things that you need in order to live, sheheim bevchinas mutzav arza. How do we represent that? The image here is that the ladder has it's firmly footed in the ground. The ladder being human life, the ground being the material needs of a human being. So the ladder, the sulam, is mutzav arza. Shayochim lich'or al-arzius. You would think that the fact that it's mutzav arza, the fact that the ladder is on the ground, means that ultimately there is this realm of physicality, of material needs, and that's what it's all about. Ach v'roisha magia shamayma. It's not true. Don't separate the two out. There's not something which is elevated and something which is mutzav arza. The ultimate goal, the ultimate destination of those who want to bring out the need of the human being, of the neshama in this world is, what should they be doing? They should be mutzav arza. You need to be in this world, but roshai magia hashamayma. You have to take all of that ladder, and bring it up and elevate it so that it reaches the heavenly sphere. Every aspect of existence, you have the possibility of elevating it into the highest possible level until it becomes in and of itself the service of God. And the Malachei Elokim, the angels of God, are going up and going down on this ladder. If you want to know what is a Malach Hashem is a tzaddik, a righteous person, somebody who excels in their service of God. They are on this ladder constantly, and what they're doing is they're constantly in this dynamic of Sulam Mutzav Arza V'Roisha Magia Hashamayma. That's the dynamic of a tzaddik's life, kol aliyah shel hatzadikim tlues bekach ad kama roshai magia shamayim kol pe'uloi seim. In every aspect of their existence, how much they can take the aspects of physicality in their lives, the material aspects of their lives, and make sure roshai magia shamayim shali dezeh heim oilim ugdolim. How do they make themselves greater? Not by staying at the top of the ladder. Sometimes they need to come down a bit in order to take more of the physical, of the material, in order to elevate it again. Once they've done that, they come back down. In every aspect of material life, come on, we're humans. We need to live life. We need to sleep. We need to eat. We need to engage with people. We need to conduct ourselves in business. We need to interact with people who are not particularly holy. And yet, in doing so, we have the opportunity of being a sulam mutzav arza v'roshai magia hashamayma. And v'zois heru kan li Yaakov, and this is exactly what was shown, what Yaakov visualized in his dream. Sha'avodosa hi la'asos mehaheter mitzvah. That Yaakov Avinu's task as the Bechir ha'avos was to make that which is permitted in order to live, in order to function in life, to make it something more, to make it a mitzvah, to make it something holy, something spiritual. Lo rak sheyikadish atzmoi b'mutar. Not only that he should sanctify himself with that which is allowed to him, he has to elevate them. It's not that in order to, let's say, this is very Hasidic, by the way, this idea is a very Hasidic idea, has its origins in the original teachings of the Baal Shem Tov and the Mezritch Magid. When you make a bracha on an apple, I'll just give you this as an example. You make a bracha on an apple, you might say that the apple itself has no relevance here. The only relevance here is that the apple is a heicha timtza, it gives you the possibility of making a bracha. So you're elevating yourself and you're eating the apple. How about, says the Baal Shem Tov, says the Mezritch Magid, and this is what is being referenced here in the Nesivos Sholom. The apple itself becomes a chefza shel kedusha. You've made a bracha, borei pri ha'etz, on the apple. In and of itself, before that, the apple was just nothing. It's just an apple that fell from the tree or was cut from the tree and got sold in the supermarket. It's of no importance. By the way, it could have got bought by somebody who wouldn't make a bracha on it. Or, hopefully not to any of the people I'm giving this shir to, you may not make a bracha on it. It's going to just remain the same apple. Could be in an apple that was eaten by a donkey. Could be in an apple that was eaten by a human. Okay? But now you ate it. Do you know what you did before you ate the apple? You made a bracha. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, borei pri ha'etz. You took an apple that was shtik garnished. It was absolutely nothing. And you turned it into a chefza shel kedusha. That's what we're talking about here. Take the world around you and elevate it. Make it something which is, I'm fond of saying this, greater than the sum of its parts. Not greater in the sense that it's great. It's still an apple. It's still any of the other things that you've got in your life. Great in the sense that it's been, I'm going to invent a word here, spiritualized. It's been holy-ized. You've turned something which was mundane and ordinary and nothing, garnished, and you've turned it into something holy, elevated. Sulam mutzav arza v'roshai magia shamayma. It's an incredible idea. And that, if you want to know who Yaakov Avinu was, he was that. But what's incredible, and this is what the Nesivos Sholom is going to deal with, is that it's not who Yaakov Avinu really was. It's quite strange. Yaakov Avinu seems, for all intents and purposes, to have been the exact opposite. Vayikatz Yaakov mishnasai. Yaakov woke up from his sleep. Vayom achen yesh Hashem b'mokem hazeh v'anochi lo yodati. He woke up from his dream. He was sleeping, and he says, "1 second, whoa, guys, what's going on here? How is it possible that Hashem is in this place? I never knew that. I always thought Hashem is in the clouds. Hashem is in the heavens. Hashem is in the yeshiva of Shem and Ever." That's what the Nesivos Sholom says is so remarkable. Wake up from your sleep, you holy person. That's who Yaakov Avinu is talking to. He's talking to you and me. If this is in the pasuk at the beginning of Vayetze, he's not talking to himself. We're not just repeating the words of Yaakov Avinu. This is not just talking about cartoons, some type of bubble above his head with the words that he spoke for our entertainment. This is a message to you. He's talking to you. Do you know what he's saying? Ochein yesh Hashem b'mokem hazeh. Hashem is right here. V'anochi lo yodati. Of course Hashem is in shul. Of course Hashem is in my house. And of course Hashem is going to be when I go to a shir, or I visit a Rebbe, or whatever it is I do, or in a neighborhood where everybody is from, whatever you're going to say. But Hashem is everywhere. That is the incredible attribute of Yaakov Avinu, that Hashem can be wherever you want him to be. You can elevate Hashem, and you can elevate a place, you can elevate where you are. It can be Paris, it can be Königsberg, it doesn't have to be Vilna. I didn't know. Says the Nesivos Sholom, until now, in the whole 14 years, what was he doing there? He was completely engaged in the study of Torah, whatever that may mean, and he was doing the service of Hashem. He was sitting and davening, communing with God. He didn't know that all the aspects of life that one is familiar with as a human being, that all the mundane, material aspects of life, that even in those you can elevate them and you can turn them into the service of God. It's only when he had this vision in his dream, it's only then, suddenly it was revealed to him that Hashem is in this place. Even in the places which are the most material, yesh eloikus, there is godliness. And it is perfectly possible to elevate those aspects of life until the ultimate location, Loishay Magia Shemaima. How unbelievable. That's what Yaakov Avinu is telling us, and that's what Yaakov Avinu represents. Al Pizeh Pirish, Gam Adakosov Lahalon, Vayeshev Yaakov, Raglov, Vayelech Artsa B'nei Kedem. And now, Vayisa, Yaakov, Raglov, Vayelech Artsa B'nei Kedem. He lifted up his legs and he went towards the lands of the east. Ma'u Loshem Vayisa Raglov, V'loi Vayelech. Why does it say he lifted up his legs? V'loi Vayelech, not simply, you could say Vayelech Artsa B'nei Kedem. After this revelation that God gave him, that he saw that Sulam Mutzav Arza V'roisha Magia Hashamayma, do you know what he understood? Even the most mundane of all things that you can do, basically what he was doing was running away. He was Vayetze Yaakov mi Be'ersheva. He was abandoning his background. He was abandoning the holy place. He was getting further and further away from the source of Kedusha in the world at that time. Vayetze Yaakov mi Be'ersheva Vayelech Harana. But do you know what he realized? Vayisa Yaakov is Raglov. You can lift up your legs so that your journey doesn't have to be a downward spiral. It can be an upward direction. It can be something where Sulam Mutzav Arza V'roishay Magia Shemaima. And that's what the word Vayisa means. That even it's Hamadregos Hayerudos Beyoyse Bechinas Regel. The regel represents the bottom of your body. It's right at the bottom. It's your foot. It's your leg. You can lift them up until they come up to the most elevated levels of holiness and sanctity. And then Vayisa Yaakov es Raglov, and then he went Vayelech Arza v'nei Kedem. You can go anywhere. Doesn't matter where you are. You can be in Kobe, Japan, and you can have the Mir Yeshiva. You can be in Shanghai, China. You can have the Mir Yeshiva. Of course, later on, Mir Yeshiva ended up in Brooklyn and ended up in Yerushalayim. But for years, during the Second World War, the strength of the learning was Vayisa Yaakov es Raglov, Vayelech Arza v'nei Kedem. They went to the Far East and even there managed to establish Vayetze Yaakov mi Be'ersheva Vayelech Harana, Sulam Mutzav Arza V'roisha Magia Shemaima. What an incredible example of how it's possible to take the Kedusha out of the most mundane place and actually take that mundane place and elevate it to the highest level possible. You can be anywhere, go anywhere. In every aspect of your life, wherever you may be, you can be in the service of Hashem. You can do acts which are godly in and of themselves, or you can turn them godly. If you want to understand everything that we're going to read about Yaakov, it's this. This is the unifying theme of all the stories regarding Yaakov Avinu. How he elevated every aspect of the things that he did, and he turned them into, as it were, karbonos, into sacrifices. And that's why he is the one who carries forward, as it were, the legacy without borders. He took those things which are heter. They have no, that the Nesivos Sholom is very fond of saying that there's a concept of sur meira and there's a concept of aseh tov. You can make sure that you're not tomei, but that doesn't mean you're kadosh. Sur meira, first make sure that you've completely eradicated anything that's bad in your life. Okay, that's one level. By the way, it's not the best level, because there's a level of aseh tov. There's a level of you've got to make sure that you're doing good. And you don't have to just do good with good. You can do good with things which are not particularly good, neutral. Or perhaps you might think of them as bad because they're going to drag you down. Or you can think of them as so unimportant. You're eating something. You're going somewhere to do business. How is it possible when you're going to do business to have a business meeting that you can elevate it? But of course you can. You can, in every given situation, you can teach people the morality of what it means to be a believer in Hashem. You can get them to say thank you, Hashem. You can get them to appreciate that the success of your business is not something that's down to you or down to random luck, but it's something that's down to the fact that you believe in Hashem and they believe in Hashem, and Hashem directs the world. I'm just giving you some very basic examples of how we can be in our lives Sulam Mutzav Arza, and we can be Vayisa Yaakov es Raglov, V'roishay Magia Shemaima, and then Vayelech Arza B'nei Kedem. Every aspect of Yaakov Avinu is a reflection of this idea that it doesn't matter where you are and what you're doing, you can elevate it to the highest possible level. Shegam mehaheter asa mitzvah, sheloi zu bilvad shenosan Torah mitomei, ela horim zois lemadregas kodosh. He lifted every single thing that he did to the highest possible level. V'zeh hirchiv es gvula kedusha, and through this he broadened the borders of kedusha. Al-Kain zochel nachla b'li mitzarim midah keneged midah, and that's why he receives an inheritance, a legacy that's without borders, and it is tit for tat, as you might say, midah keneged midah. V'zeu inyan hama'aneg es hashabbos shenoisnin lo nachla b'li mitzarim. And now we understand this idea that somebody who's ma'aneg the Shabbos, that he gets nachla b'li mitzarim, a legacy without borders. What are we talking about? You're going to see here that the translation of the word is going to be really important. The word hama'aneg, we slightly mistranslated it before. Lo omru hamis'aneg b'Shabbos. We don't say somebody who takes pleasure, regales as a result of Shabbos. It's so nice that it's Shabbos today. That's not what we're talking about. That's how we would generally understand the pasuk. But the word ma'aneg is a little bit ambiguous. It's not hamis'aneg b'Shabbos. Shema'aneg es atzmoi b'Shabbos kodesh, because that means that he pleasures himself as a result of having this day called Shabbos. That's not what we're talking about. Elo hama'aneg es haShabbos. Somebody who delights the Shabbos. What does that mean? What are we talking about? Shepirushai al-dvar de'isa b'zar HaKodesh. The Zohar explains what it means. The Zohar, the principal work of Kabbalah, explains, if you look at it, it says, Shabbos ihu yoima de nishmasa v'lav yoima de gufa klal. Do you know what Shabbos is? Shabbos is the ultimate soul day. It's the day of the soul, not a day of the body. 1 second. Don't I eat a good chunt on Shabbos? Don't I like eating Lokschenkugel and Kartoffelkugel on Shabbos? Surely that's a matter of the body, it's not a matter of the soul. What are we talking about? When I eat chicken soup on Friday night, and it's got good knedels in it and a bit of Lokschen, surely that's taking pleasure out of Shabbos, I mean, would I eat that during the week? How am I meant to fit that into this concept of ma'aneg es ha-Shabbos? Shabbos ihu yom b'denishmasa, says the Zohar. Shabbos is surely a day of the soul. Eating chicken soup doesn't sound like a soul activity, says the Nesivos Sholom. Shemoise b'Shabbos kodesh es kol ta'nuge haguf l'neshama, because you have to give over all of the pleasures of the body to the soul on Shabbos. You know what that means? It's an incredible idea. Not sure how, it's difficult to internalize it. You need to think about it. But imagine if you could turn all of the physical pleasure you have on Shabbos into a spiritual experience. Of course, there's the physical experience, but imagine you could completely eradicate the physical pleasure of eating a good chunt on Shabbos, or eating a good chicken soup on Shabbos. And you could turn it into something that's completely spiritual. That's the idea here. Hama'aneg es ha-Shabbos. You turn this idea of Shabbos being a neshama day into something that's not just an neshama in the holy things. I daven on Shabbos, I daven with a lot of kavana. That's not what we're talking about. But you take the physical aspects of the day, the guf aspects of the day, and you turn them into the Shabbos. Hama'aneg es ha-Shabbos. What do we do? It's called tanuge haguf l'neshama lechelek elokami mal. I turn them into something which is an aspect, a part of a God above. Now you've expanded. You've spread beyond the natural borders of Kedusha, which we know, which we can define. It's quite easy to define them. Now you've spread them to beyond. You've gone beyond that border. You've crossed over that border into a new country. It's called the country of the Guf. It's not the country of the Neshama. That's what it means. We're not talking about expanding physically. By the way, you may expand physically as well if you eat too much chulent. That's what we're talking about. You know what that's talking about? It's talking about Gvul Belimat Sorim. There's no borders here. You can take any aspect of Shabbos, anything that you do on Shabbos, which is for the purpose of whatever it is that Shabbos represents, and you can turn it into a neshama experience. Imagine that. Everything that you do on Shabbos can be a neshama experience. You've expanded the borders of Kedusha. Shemachnis es mashenimtza tachas shilton haguf. You've taken that which is under the rubric of just your physical life, of the things that you do in life, of your body. And what have you done? L'rshus haneshama. You've brought them into the territory, under the control of the neshama. Lemantuchal haneshama lisaneg betanugeha. As a result of you getting physical pleasure and material pleasure, now your neshama is getting pleasure as well. V'alkein noisnim le'midah keneged midah nachla b'limat sorim. You get nachla b'limat sorim. That's what you're going to get, is the reward for treating Shabbos in this way. That's why it's Shabbos. So why particularly Shabbos? Why is it this the only mitzvah where it's relevant, where it applies? Surely this should apply to anything, any aspect of a person's life that they give over to Hashem, whatever it is that they do. Says the Nesivos Sholom, Yesh lefarish al pi ma'amar moran hakodesh mikobrin. The Kobrina says, and he quotes here another ancestor of the founder of the Slonim Chasidus. He says as follows: Al apostle k'shmartem es haShabbos ki kodesh hi lochem. You should guard the Shabbos. You should secure every aspect of Shabbos. So shmartem, you should observe the Shabbos. Ki kodesh hi lochem, because it's holy for you. That's the literal translation. But he says ki kodesh hi lochem. But Shabbos kodesh. On Shabbos, on the holy Shabbos, yesh koyach hakedusha lekadesh es kol inyonei lochem. You can take the lochem in you and you can completely conquer it. You can subjugate it. You can sanctify it by making sure it doesn't exist. Ha'inyonim hagashmiyim shegam heim yu kodesh. Even the aspects of your physical existence can be completely overwhelmed by the kedusha of your neshama, if that's what you intend them to do, and that's something that's unique to Shabbos. The Pasuk says, "Ushmartem es haShabbos ki kodesh hi lochem." V'hainu, shebechol hashavua ein Yehudi yochel lahalos enyonim agashmiyim lemadrego zu. In an ordinary weekday, you can try and do this, but the koyach, the spiritual energy, doesn't exist to do it to the same extent as it exists on Shabbos. Ki im ledargas Torah. The only thing you can do during the week is to make sure that you are a sur meirah. That much you can do. You can get to the level of making sure that you're pure, that you're not impure. That's one level, and it's very important. You couldn't reach the level of Asay Tov, of Kedusha, unless you get to the level of Sur Meirah. Although elsewhere the Nesivos Sholom talks about this in as two separate ideals. But here he combines the two, and he says that during the week, what you can do is you can be a Sur Meirah. You can make yourself Toher. But how do you make yourself Kadosh? How do you become an Asay Tov? V'rak b'Shabbos Kodesh. That's only possible on Shabbos. Yeshes hamadrego shel Kadosh. This element of being Kadosh, of Kedusha, of holiness, of sanctity, of being special, unique, that possibility only exists on Shabbos. K'dichsiv ushmartem es haShabbos ki kodesh hi lochem. The word lochem, the kedusha of lochem, is only possible if you are somebody who is ushmartem es haShabbos. Lochem shebeshabbos hakol kodesh, because on Shabbos the possibility of making everything holy, not just tahor, but holy, that exists on Shabbos. V'lochein davka b'Shabbos kodesh nema shenoisim nachla b'limud sorim. And it's only on Shabbos that you have this possibility of the reward of nachla b'limud sorim. Just want to add one last piece before we conclude, and I'm not going to read it. The Nesivos Sholom wants to add that Yaakov Avinu is a representative or representation of Torah. And he goes into it in quite some detail. He says that Yaakov Avinu, in and of himself, is Torah. That's what he is. That's the Mahus of Yaakov is Torah. We say Titein Emes li Yaakov. Emes, of course, is a synonym for Torah. And Torah and Yaakov are synonymous. Which means that Yaakov, being this concept of Nachla b'limud sorim, it spills over into the concept of Torah. That somebody who studies Torah with passion and in any location and in any given situation, he has the possibility, he puts it most beautifully, he says, you can have access to the Or HaGonos, to the hidden light that has no borders. Can you imagine that? Because light has borders. You know what the borders are? In the morning, before morning, it was dark. And in the evening, as the day ebbs away, it's going to get dark. But imagine the Or HaGonos, the hidden light that God hid at the beginning of creation, the source of light, and not just light as we understand it, but spiritual light. Imagine that as something that you can tap into, that you can gain access to. Do you know how you could gain access to it? If you study Torah. God promises that there'll be nachla b'limud sorim, that you will have an inheritance, you will have a legacy without borders, that you will have the true light. The light of Torah, the light of Yaakov Avinu, is something that you can inject into your life if you do it constantly and in any given situation. Not limit yourself. If you don't limit yourself in terms of the study of Torah, if the study of Torah is something that you will do in any given situation, wherever you can. This week I was at a wedding and I noticed how many people bring a little Mishnais with them or a Gemara. They want to study Daf Yomi, learn Mishnais in the downtime that exists in weddings as you're waiting for this to happen or that to happen. That's what we're talking about. That's Titein Emes li Yaakov. That is Nachla b'limud sorim. That's something which has no gvul, that has no border, and that is the life of a Jew. That even in our physical limitations, we have physical limitations, we can become unlimited. We're not limited. We have no borders, and that is in the zchus of Yaakov Avinu, and that is because Yaakov Avinu is the Bechir HaAvos. We'll leave it here for today. Thank you so much.